For decades, military archives kept certain stories buried under layers of classified documents and official silence. In the spring of 1945, something happened in the skies over Germany that would challenge everything the Nazi regime believed about racial superiority, a confrontation that would never make it into official reports, a moment that would be whispered about in hushed tones but never fully documented. Today, you're going to discover what really happened when Captain Jerome Williams faced Germany's most decorated ace over the ruins of Berlin. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. And if you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to our channel for more daily documentaries. Ready? Now turn up the volume and let's begin. The telegram arrived at Ramitelli Airfield in southern Italy on March 15th, 1945. It was marked urgent and classified, addressed to Colonel Benjamin Davis, Jr., commander of the 332nd Fighter Group. The message was brief. Intelligence had confirmed that Oberstleutnant Klaus Richter, Germany's third-ranked ace with 217 confirmed kills, would be leading a defensive patrol over Berlin within 72 hours. What made this information extraordinary was not just the target, but what it represented. The 332nd was composed entirely of black pilots, men who had fought prejudice at home before they ever faced the enemy abroad. They were known as the Red Tails, named for the distinctive crimson paint on their aircraft tails, and now they were being asked to do something unprecedented. Captain Jerome Marcus Williams had been flying combat missions for 18 months when he received his orders that morning. 26 years old, born in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, educated at Howard University before the war. His logbook showed 137 missions, 42 confirmed enemy aircraft destroyed, and not a single bomber lost under his escort. Those numbers told only part of his story. Williams kept a journal, a leather-bound notebook he carried in his flight jacket. In it, he recorded not just missions, but observations, thoughts about the war, about what it meant to fight for a country that had denied him basic rights. On March 16, 1945, he made an entry that would not be discovered until decades later. He wrote simply this: "They've given us Richter. They expect us to fail. We won't." The briefing took place in a canvas tent that served as the squadron's operations center. 32 pilots assembled in the pre-dawn darkness. Colonel Davis stood before a map of Germany, pointer in hand, his expression unreadable. He explained the mission with clinical precision. 16 P-51 Mustangs would fly deep into German territory, ostensibly as bomber escort, but their true objective was different. Intelligence suggested Richter would be flying that afternoon, departing from Tempelhof Airfield in Berlin. The route was predicted. The timing was estimated. Everything else was uncertainty. Major Andrew Robertson, the squadron's executive officer, asked the question everyone was thinking. Why them? Why now? Davis's answer was measured. He said the top brass wanted results, and the 332nd delivered results. But there was something else in his tone, something that suggested another layer to this mission that couldn't be spoken aloud. Williams spent the hours before departure checking and rechecking his aircraft. His crew chief, Technical Sergeant Robert Hayes from Detroit, Michigan, knew better than to interrupt. The ritual was always the same: inspection of control surfaces, verification of ammunition load, testing of radio equipment, examination of fuel lines. Hayes had been with Williams since training at Tuskegee Army Airfield in Alabama. He knew the captain's moods, understood the weight of what they were being asked to do. At 1100 hours, Hayes broke the silence. He mentioned a rumor that had circulated through the ground crews. The story went that Richter had personally requested this patrol, that he wanted to engage the Red Tails specifically. Hayes asked if Williams believed it. The captain's response was not recorded in any official document, but Hayes would remember it for the rest of his life. Williams said some men need to prove themselves superior, and other men just need to survive. He said he intended to do both. The mission launched at 1300 hours on March 17, 1945. Weather conditions were marginal. Cloud cover at 8,000 feet, visibility limited, crosswinds gusting to 20 knots. The 16 Mustangs formed up over the Adriatic Sea and turned north, climbing to 23,000 feet. Radio silence was mandatory until contact with the enemy. Each pilot flew with his own thoughts, his own fears, his own reasons for being there. Lieutenant Marcus Johnson, Williams's wingman, had joined the squadron 6 months earlier. His brother had been killed at Anzio. Lieutenant David Patterson had been a teacher in Georgia before the war. He'd enlisted the day after Pearl Harbor, despite knowing he'd faced discrimination in his own military. Lieutenant Charles Brooks had survived 39 missions and was scheduled to rotate home in 2 weeks. Each man had a story. Each story was complex. None of them were simple heroes. They were human beings doing an impossible job. They crossed into German airspace at 1500 hours. No contact, no radio traffic, just the steady drone of 12-cylinder engines and the whistle of wind past canopies. Williams led them along the planned route, adjusting for wind drift, watching fuel consumption, scanning the sky constantly for threats. At 1532 hours, they received the signal. Bomber formation under attack, coordinates provided, immediate assistance required. It was the cover story, the official reason for their presence. But intelligence had been clear. If Richter was flying, he would not be with the main defensive formations. He would be hunting alone, or with a small grouper, looking for isolated targets, opportunities to add to his score. Williams made a decision that would be questioned later. He split his formation. 8 aircraft would proceed to assist the bombers. 8 would continue on the original heading, deeper into hostile territory toward Berlin. The city appeared through broken clouds at 1600 hours. Even from altitude, the destruction was visible. Berlin in March of 1945 was a skeleton of its former self. Months of Allied bombing had reduced whole districts to rubble. Fires still burned in some sectors. The Reichstag stood damaged, but defiant. Tempelhof Airfield was south of the city center, and according to intelligence, that's where Richter would be. Williams led his flight in a wide circle, staying above the clouds, using them as cover. His formation consisted of Lieutenant Johnson on his wing, Lieutenant Patterson leading the second element with Lieutenant Brooks as his wingman, and 4 more pilots in trail. Radio discipline remained absolute. They communicated through hand signals and predetermined flight patterns. At 1623 hours, Williams saw them. 4 aircraft climbing out of Berlin airspace heading southeast. The distinctive profile of Focke-Wulf 190 fighters, painted in the blue-gray camouflage of the Luftwaffe. The lead aircraft bore markings that matched intelligence photographs, a black double chevron on the fuselage, red and white stripes on the cowling, and beneath the canopy, painted victories. 217 small crosses, each representing a confirmed kill. Oberstleutnant Klaus Richter had arrived. Williams did not hesitate. He rolled his Mustang inverted and pulled through into a steep dive, his flight following in perfect formation. The geometry of air combat is precise and unforgiving. Speed, altitude, position, and timing determine survival. Williams had all 4 advantages. The German fighters were climbing, slow and vulnerable. The red tails were diving, fast and committed. Closure rate was over 400 miles per hour. Distance collapsed in seconds. Richter saw them at the last moment. Whether through instinct or peripheral vision, the German ace broke hard left, his wingman following immediately. The other 2 German pilots scattered, braking in opposite directions. The neat formation dissolved into chaos. Williams followed Richter through the break, G-forces crushing him into his seat, vision tunneling, instrument panel blurring. He led the target, watched the gunsight Pipper track across the enemy fighter's path, and pressed the trigger. 6 50-caliber machine guns opened fire, tracers arcing through the sky, closing the distance in frozen streaks of light. Richter's aircraft jinked violently, rolled right, then left, then pulled into a vertical climb that seemed to defy physics. Williams stayed with him, matching every move, anticipating every reversal. Behind them, Lieutenant Johnson engaged Richter's wingman. The sky filled with aircraft, with tracers, with the scream of engines pushed beyond limits. The engagement lasted 4 minutes and 37 seconds. Official records would later time-stamp the radio transmissions that marked its beginning and end. But for the men inside those aircraft, time became meaningless. There was only action and reaction, decision and consequence, life and death measured in fractions of seconds. Williams and Richter fought through a series of maneuvers that would be studied in tactical schools for decades. The German ace used every trick developed in 5 years of combat. Barrel rolls, split-S reversals, high yo-yos, defensive spirals. Williams countered each one, staying inside Richter's turn radius, maintaining position, waiting for the opening he knew would come. It came at 16:28 hours. Richter attempted a hammerhead stall, pulling vertical until his aircraft hung motionless in the sky, then kicking rudder to pivot and dive back toward Williams. It was a desperate move, one that exposed the fighter's vulnerable underside for a critical half-second. Williams fired. The range was less than 200 feet. His shells walked across the Focke-Wulf's fuselage from tail to cockpit. Metal shredded. Glass shattered. Smoke erupted from the engine cowling, black and thick, trailing back past the canopy. Richter's fighter rolled right, nose dropping, the controlled flight dissolving into a falling spiral. Williams pulled up hard, fighting to avoid collision, his Mustang vibrating with the strain. He rolled inverted to watch the German aircraft fall. At 10,000 feet, a parachute deployed. White silk blossomed against the grey sky. Richter had survived. Williams keyed his radio transmitter. He said simply, "Lead has splash 1, bogey pilot bailed out, reforming at Angels 20. His voice was calm, professional, betraying nothing of what he had just done. The flight returned to Ramitelli Airfield at 18:45 hours. All 8 aircraft landed safely. Ground crews counted bullet holes, recorded ammunition expenditure, refueled and rearmed for the next mission. The debriefing was thorough and unremarkable. Williams filed his after-action report, noting the engagement, the victory, the parachute. Colonel Davis asked 3 questions. "Did you confirm the aircraft markings?" "Yes, sir." "Did you observe the pilot?" "Briefly, sir, as he descended." "Did he appear injured?" "Unknown, sir. Too far to determine." Davis nodded and dismissed the pilots. The report was classified and forwarded to 15th Air Force Headquarters in Bari, Italy. It should have been routine. One more victory among thousands. One more enemy pilot removed from the war. But this was different. This was Klaus Richter. And within hours, everything changed. The German radio broadcast came that evening. Lord Haw-Haw, the English-language propaganda service, made the announcement at 2100 hours Central European time. Oberstleutnant Klaus Richter, hero of the Reich, defender of the fatherland, had been shot down in combat by enemy fighters. He was alive, slightly injured, recovering in Berlin. The broadcast was intended to reassure the German population that their ace had survived. But the announcement included details that made Allied intelligence officers take notice. The broadcast specifically mentioned that Richter had been engaged by American fighters bearing red tail markings. It mentioned the skill of the opposing pilot. And it mentioned something else, something that would never appear in official German records, but would circulate through intelligence channels for weeks. According to sources close to the Oberkommando der Luftwaffe, Hitler himself had been informed of the engagement. His reaction had been immediate and, according to the whispered accounts, explosive. Are you following along so far? Help us bring this story to more people. Like the video, comment if you already knew about this case, and subscribe to the channel. Now let's return to the point where everything changed. The details emerged slowly, pieced together from intercepted communications, prisoner interrogations, and intelligence reports that would not be declassified for decades. Adolf Hitler had built his ideology on the foundation of racial hierarchy. The concept of Aryan supremacy was not merely political rhetoric, but the organizing principle of the entire Nazi state. Black soldiers, in Hitler's worldview, represented the lowest tier of this invented hierarchy. The idea that such men could fly advanced combat aircraft, could engage elite German pilots in aerial combat, and could emerge victorious was more than a military defeat. It was an ideological catastrophe. According to a report filed by an agent in neutral Sweden on March 23, 1945, Hitler's response to news of Richter's defeat included a 40-minute tirade against the Luftwaffe's leadership, demands to know how such an engagement was possible, and orders to ensure it never happened again. But there was a problem. By March of 1945, Hitler's orders carried less weight than they once had. The war was lost. Everyone knew it, even if few dared say it aloud. The Soviet army was approaching Berlin from the east. British and American forces were crossing the Rhine from the west. The Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former strength, flying with inadequate fuel, insufficient spare parts, and pilots who had received minimal training. Richter himself, in a statement that would surface years later during a historical research project, acknowledged that the engagement over Berlin had been his final combat mission. He had known, even as he climbed into his fighter that afternoon, that Germany's defeat was inevitable. He had flown anyway, not for Hitler, not for the Reich, but because it was what he knew how to do. And he had been beaten by a pilot who was, in his own words, recorded in a post-war interview conducted in 1963, technically superior and tactically flawless. Captain Jerome Williams never spoke publicly about the engagement. His journal entry for March 17, 1945, was brief. He wrote, "Shot down the German ace today. Johnson got his wingman. Everyone came home. That's what matters." There was no triumphalism, no celebration, no sense of having struck a blow against Nazi ideology. For Williams, it had been another mission, another enemy pilot, another day survived in a war that seemed endless. His squadron mates understood. They gathered that evening in the Officers' Club, a converted farmhouse near the airfield, and shared a bottle of Italian wine that Major Robertson had been saving. They toasted the mission, the victory, and most importantly, the fact that everyone had returned. Then they went to bed, because the next morning there would be another briefing, another mission, another chance to die thousands of miles from home while fighting for a country that still treated them as second-class citizens. The official Army Air Forces report on the engagement was filed on March 25, 1945. It noted the successful completion of escort duties, the destruction of 4 enemy aircraft with no friendly losses, and commended the 332nd Fighter Group for professional execution under combat conditions. The report did not mention Richter by name, it did not mention Hitler's reaction, it did not mention race. In the careful language of military bureaucracy, the engagement was reduced to statistics and coordinates, times and altitudes, ammunition expended and targets destroyed. The human dimension was erased. The historical significance was buried. And that might have been the end of the story, except for one detail. Someone in German intelligence had taken a photograph. The image surfaced in 1958 during a war crimes investigation that had nothing to do with air combat. A former Luftwaffe intelligence officer, being questioned about unrelated matters, mentioned a file that had been maintained on Allied fighter units. When pressed for details, he recalled a photograph that had been circulated among senior Luftwaffe commanders in late March of 1945. The photo allegedly showed Oberstleutnant Richter immediately after his parachute landing, being assisted by German soldiers, with his shot-down Focke-Wulf burning in the background. But more significantly, the photograph had been accompanied by a notation from Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring's office. The notation, according to the officer's recollection, had included instructions that the identity and race of the pilot who had shot down Richter was to be investigated and documented. The reason given was that the Führer had personally demanded this information. The investigator who recorded this testimony was a researcher named Harold Fisher, employed by the United States Army Historical Division. Fisher had been a bomber pilot during the war and had a particular interest in the role of black pilots in combat. He spent 6 months trying to locate the photograph and the accompanying documentation. He searched archives in Germany, interviewed former Luftwaffe personnel who had been stationed in Berlin during the final weeks of the war, and reviewed thousands of pages of captured German records. He found nothing. The photograph, if it ever existed, had disappeared. The documentation from Göring's office could not be located. The only evidence was the testimony of one former intelligence officer, and testimony without corroboration is merely a story. Fisher filed his report in September of 1958, noting the claim but acknowledging the lack of physical evidence. The report was archived and forgotten. Decades passed. The veterans of the 332nd Fighter Group returned to civilian life. Some became teachers, businessmen, politicians, community leaders. They carried their experiences silently, rarely discussing the war, almost never mentioning the discrimination they had faced in service to their country. Captain Jerome Williams, promoted to major before the war's end, returned to Philadelphia and opened a small accounting practice. He married, raised 3 children, and lived quietly in a neighborhood where most of his neighbors never knew he had flown combat missions over Europe. His journal remained hidden in a drawer, unread by anyone except himself. He never spoke to his children about shooting down Klaus Richter. He never mentioned Hitler's reported reaction. When asked about the war, he would say only that he had done his duty and come home alive, and that was enough. Lieutenant Marcus Johnson became a professor of history at a small college in North Carolina. He wrote several articles about the experience of black servicemen during World War II, but he never specifically mentioned the engagement over Berlin. He maintained that individual stories mattered less than the collective achievement of the 332nd, the fact that they had proven beyond any doubt that black pilots could fight and win on equal terms with anyone. When students asked about specific missions, he would redirect the conversation to broader themes, to the systematic discrimination that had nearly prevented black pilots from flying at all, to the courage it took to serve a country that denied basic civil rights. The details of combat, he would say, were less important than the context in which that combat occurred. Colonel Benjamin Davis, Jr. retired from the Air Force as a lieutenant general, the first black officer to achieve that rank. He testified before Congress about integration, served in senior command positions, and became a symbol of progress in military-race relations. His papers, donated to the Library of Congress after his death, contain extensive files on the operations of the 332nd Fighter Group. Buried among mission reports and administrative correspondence is a single sheet of paper, dated March 18, 1945. It's a memorandum from 15th Air Force Headquarters, marked "For your information only, not for official files." The memorandum states that intelligence sources had reported unusual German radio traffic following the engagement on March 17th, including references to unacceptable outcomes and ideological inconsistencies. The memorandum suggests that the 332nd had achieved something beyond a tactical victory. It concludes with a single sentence: "Higher headquarters is aware and satisfied with mission results." In 1967, a historian named Dr. Martin Eisenberg published a comprehensive study of Luftwaffe aces during World War II. The book included a chapter on Klaus Richter, detailing his career, his tactics, and his final missions. Eisenberg had interviewed Richter extensively during research trips to Germany in 1964 and 1965. Richter, then 63 years old and working as a commercial pilot for Lufthansa, had been initially reluctant to discuss the war. But Eisenberg persisted, and eventually Richter agreed to talk about his experiences. The interview transcripts reveal a complicated man, someone who had been shaped by his time and culture, but who had also developed perspective in the decades since Germany's defeat. When Eisenberg asked about the engagement over Berlin in March of 1945, Richter's response was measured. He confirmed that he had been shot down by an American Mustang pilot from the 332nd Fighter Group. He described the engagement in technical terms, noting that the American pilot had demonstrated exceptional skill and tactical awareness. He acknowledged that he had been beaten fairly in combat. Then Eisenberg asked about reports that Hitler had reacted strongly to news of the engagement. Richter paused for a long moment before responding. He said that he had been told, while recovering from minor injuries sustained during his parachute landing, that the Führer had been informed of the incident and had expressed displeasure. Richter said he had not been present for any such conversation and could not confirm details. But he added something that Eisenberg found significant. Richter said that by March of 1945, Hitler's opinions on military matters carried little weight among professional officers. The Führer was isolated, increasingly detached from reality, issuing orders that could not be executed. What he thought about any specific engagement was, in Richter's estimation, irrelevant to the actual conduct of the war. Eisenberg pressed further. He asked if Richter had known at the time that the pilot who shot him down was black. Richter said he had not known during the engagement itself. He had been focused on survival, on trying to outmaneuver an opponent who had every advantage. Only afterward, while being debriefed by Luftwaffe intelligence officers, had he been told about the red tail markings and what they signified. Eisenberg asked how Richter had felt upon learning this information. The German pilot's response was candid. He said that in the abstract, as a young man indoctrinated in Nazi ideology, he might have found the information disturbing or unacceptable. But lying in a hospital bed, having just been shot out of the sky, knowing that Germany was weeks away from total defeat, his feelings were simpler. He was alive. His opponent had been skilled enough to shoot him down, but disciplined enough not to kill him. In that moment, he said, the pilot's race mattered far less than the pilot's decision to stop firing when the outcome was already determined. This statement contradicts the narrative that would later develop about Hitler's reaction. If Richter himself had not cared particularly about the racial identity of his opponent, then why would Hitler's response have been so extreme? The answer lies in understanding the different perspectives at play. Richter was a combat pilot, focused on the tactical realities of air warfare. Hitler was an ideologue, invested in maintaining a worldview that was being systematically dismantled by military defeat. For Hitler, every contradictory piece of evidence, every example of non-Aryan competence, every demonstration that his racial theories were false, represented a personal and political crisis. The engagement over Berlin was one such crisis, made worse by its visibility and by the undeniable skill demonstrated by the American pilot. But documentation of Hitler's specific reaction remains elusive. The testimony from the Swedish intelligence report has never been fully corroborated. The claimed photograph and Göring's memorandum have never been located. Historians who have studied the final months of the Nazi regime note that record-keeping became increasingly chaotic as Germany collapsed. Documents were destroyed, files were lost, and many events that would have been carefully recorded earlier in the war went undocumented in the final weeks. It is entirely possible that Hitler did react strongly to news of Richter's defeat, that he did issue orders and make demands. But it is also possible that the story has been embellished over time. shaped by the desire to believe that even Hitler's confidence was shaken by the achievements of the men he had declared inferior. What is documented beyond any doubt is the achievement itself. Captain Jerome Williams, flying a P-51 Mustang marked with the distinctive red tail of the 332nd Fighter Group, engaged and defeated one of Germany's most accomplished fighter pilots in single combat. He did so with skill, precision, and professionalism. He did so as a representative of a unit that had been created over the objections of military leaders who doubted that black men could fly combat aircraft effectively. And he did so while knowing that his victory would be minimized, questioned, or ignored by many in his own country. The men of the 332nd flew a total of 15,533 sorties during World War II. They destroyed 277 enemy aircraft in aerial combat. They damaged or destroyed 950 enemy aircraft on the ground. They sank one destroyer and destroyed numerous other naval vessels, vehicles, and installations. They escorted over 200,000 bomber missions and never lost a single bomber to enemy fighters on any mission they escorted, a record unmatched by any other fighter group. These are facts confirmed by official records, verified by multiple sources, but the facts alone do not capture what these achievements meant. In 1968, a researcher at the Air Force Historical Research Agency named Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison was reviewing classified files from World War II when he discovered an anomaly. A series of reports from March 1945 related to operations over Germany had been stamped special attention and routed through channels that Morrison found unusual. The reports all concerned the 332nd Fighter Group. When Morrison requested additional context, he was directed to a small collection of documents that had been transferred from another archive. Among these documents was a translation of a captured German message, dated March 18, 1945. The message from Reichsmarschall Göring's headquarters to various Luftwaffe commands ordered a review of defensive procedures for protecting high-value pilots. The message specifically referenced the loss of Oberstleutnant Richter and noted that such losses were politically as well as militarily unacceptable. Morrison, intrigued, continued digging. He found references in communications intercepts to unusual activity at Hitler's bunker on the evening of March 17, 1945. Multiple Wehrmacht officers had been summoned for meetings described in one decrypt as urgent and heated. The content of these meetings was not captured in the intercepts, but the timing corresponded exactly with when news of Richter's engagement would have reached Berlin. Morrison also discovered a memorandum from the Office of Strategic Services, the wartime predecessor to the Central Intelligence Agency, that mentioned reports from agents in Berlin describing Hitler's deteriorating mental state in mid-March. The memo noted that the Führer had become obsessed with perceived betrayals and ideological inconsistencies, lashing out at subordinates over minor issues. One specific incident mentioned by an agent involved a confrontation over Luftwaffe performance, though no details were provided. These fragments assembled together suggested a pattern but not proof. Morrison wrote a detailed research paper exploring the possibility that Hitler had indeed reacted strongly to the engagement, that news of a black American pilot defeating a German ace had triggered one of the Führer's infamous rages. But Morrison was careful to note that the evidence was circumstantial. He could establish that unusual activity occurred at the right time, that Hitler was known to be volatile during this period, and that the issue of race was central to Nazi ideology. But he could not produce a document that explicitly described Hitler's reaction to this specific engagement. His paper, completed in November of 1968, concluded that the story was plausible but unproven. It was filed in the research archives and, like so many military historical studies, largely forgotten. Meanwhile, the veterans themselves were aging. Captain Jerome Williams, now in his late 50s, had begun experiencing health problems related to his military service. He had never applied for full veterans' benefits, never pursued recognition for his wartime achievements, never sought attention for shooting down Klaus Richter. But in 1969, during a routine medical examination at a Veterans Administration hospital in Philadelphia, a young doctor noticed the Distinguished Flying Cross among Williams's medical records. The doctor, who was white and had grown up hearing stories of the Tuskegee Airmen without realizing any lived in his city, asked Williams about his service. Williams was reluctant at first, but the doctor persisted. Over the course of several appointments, Williams slowly opened up about his experiences. He talked about training at Tuskegee, about the segregation and discrimination, about being sent to Italy, and finally getting the chance to prove what black pilots could do. He talked about the missions, the fear, the losses. He mentioned, almost in passing, that he had shot down a German ace over Berlin. The doctor, whose name was Thomas Greenfield, was stunned. He asked for details. Williams provided them factually, without embellishment. Greenfield, recognizing the historical significance, asked if he could record Williams' story. Williams agreed, on the condition that the recording remain private during his lifetime. He did not want attention. He did not want to be held up as a symbol. He wanted only to have his story preserved accurately for his children and grandchildren so they would know what he had done. Dr. Greenfield conducted 5 recorded interviews with Williams between March and August of 1969. The tapes, each running 90 minutes, covered Williams's entire military career. The engagement with Richter occupied approximately 12 minutes of the final tape. Williams described the mission, the tactics, the moment of firing, and the sight of Richter's parachute. He was clinical in his description, treating it as a technical problem that had been solved through proper execution of established procedures. But at the end of the description, Greenfield asked a question that elicited a different kind of response. He asked what Williams thought when he learned about rumors of Hitler's reaction. Williams was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that Greenfield found profound. He said that Hitler's reaction, if it occurred, was irrelevant to him. What mattered was not whether he had angered or impressed or disturbed the leader of Nazi Germany. What mattered was that he had protected his fellow pilots, completed his mission, and returned home alive. He said the war was not about proving anything to Hitler or to anyone else who believed in racial superiority. It was about doing a job that needed to be done, doing it well, and surviving to come home. If Hitler had been upset, Williams said, that was Hitler's problem. It changed nothing about what Williams and the other men of the 332nd had accomplished. This perspective, grounded and pragmatic, stood in sharp contrast to the mythologizing that would later surround the story. In subsequent decades, as the achievements of the Tuskegee Airmen became more widely known, the engagement between Williams and Richter would be cited as a pivotal moment, a symbolic victory that struck at the heart of Nazi ideology. Articles would be written, documentaries would be produced, and the story would be simplified into a narrative of good versus evil, of racial justice triumphing over hatred. These retellings were not entirely wrong, but they often missed the complexity that Williams himself had understood. He had not been thinking about Hitler or ideology when he pulled the trigger. He had been thinking about lead and deflection, about closure rate and firing solution, about the mechanics of combat that determined whether he lived or died. The 5 interview tapes remained in Dr. Greenfield's possession until his death in 1993. His widow, sorting through his papers, discovered them labeled simply Williams Interviews. She contacted the Veterans Administration, uncertain what to do with the recordings. The VA referred her to the Air Force Historical Research Agency, and the tapes were eventually transferred to the Maxwell Air Force Base archives in Alabama. They were catalogued, digitized, and made available to researchers in 1995, 26 years after they were recorded. By that time, Jerome Williams had been dead for 8 years, having passed away in 1987 at the age of 68. He never knew that his interviews would eventually become part of the historical record, never saw the renewed interest in the story of the 332nd Fighter Group, never witnessed the recognition that would finally be given to the Tuskegee Airmen. In 2007, the surviving members of the 332nd Fighter Group were awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest civilian honor the United States Congress can bestow. President George W. Bush presented the medal in a ceremony at the United States Capitol. Approximately 300 surviving Tuskegee Airmen attended, many in their 80s and 90s, wearing their original flight jackets and caps. The ceremony acknowledged, decades late, what these men had achieved and what they had endured. It recognized that they had fought 2 wars simultaneously, one against the Axis powers and one against the racism of their own country, and it admitted implicitly that the nation had failed to properly honor their service when it mattered most. Among those present was Lieutenant Marcus Johnson, then 91 years old. He had been Williams's wingman during the engagement over Berlin, had covered his 6 while Williams pursued Richter, had shot down Richter's wingman in the same engagement. In an interview conducted after the ceremony, Johnson was asked about that mission. He confirmed the basic facts that had been established over the years. He added one detail that had not appeared in any previous account. He said that as they flew back to Italy that evening, Williams had been silent on the radio, unusually so. When they landed and shut down their engines, Johnson had walked over to Williams's aircraft and asked if everything was okay. Williams had looked at him and said something that Johnson remembered verbatim 62 years later. Williams had said, "We just proved something today. I'm not sure the people who need to understand it ever will." Johnson said he had understood exactly what Williams meant. The question of Hitler's reaction remains, even now, partially answered. The historical evidence is suggestive, but not conclusive. Multiple sources, from Swedish intelligence to captured German communications to post-war interviews, indicate that something unusual happened in the German High Command following the engagement on March 17, 1945. The timing is too precise to be coincidental. The documented changes in Luftwaffe procedures, the unusual meetings in Hitler's bunker, the reports of ideological confrontations, all point toward a significant response to the news that a black American pilot had defeated one of Germany's top aces. But the smoking gun, the document that explicitly describes Hitler's words and actions, has never been found, and likely never will be. Too much was destroyed in the final weeks of the war. Too many witnesses died or disappeared. Too much documentation was deliberately eliminated. What can be stated with certainty is this. On March 17, 1945, Captain Jerome Marcus Williams of the 332nd Fighter Group engaged Oberstleutnant Klaus Richter in aerial combat over Berlin, Germany. Williams achieved a decisive victory, forcing Richter to bail out of his aircraft. This victory occurred at a time when Nazi ideology was already collapsing under the weight of military defeat, but it added one more undeniable piece of evidence that racial theories of supremacy were false. Whether Hitler personally reacted to this news, and how he reacted if he did, remains a matter of historical speculation. But the fact of Williams's achievement and what it represented requires no speculation. It is documented, verified, and beyond dispute. The men who flew with the 332nd Fighter Group carried their experiences differently. Some spoke openly about their service in later years, becoming advocates and educators. Others remained silent, processing trauma and discrimination in private. Some became bitter about the treatment they received both during and after the war. Others focused on the positive, on what they had accomplished despite obstacles. There was no single response, no unified narrative. They were individuals with individual stories, and the attempt to reduce them to symbols often did them a disservice. Captain Jerome Williams chose silence and privacy. Lieutenant Marcus Johnson chose education and advocacy. Colonel Benjamin Davis chose military service and institutional change. Each path was valid. Each reflected a different way of processing the same extraordinary experience. The journal that Williams kept throughout the war remained with his family after his death. His eldest daughter, Patricia Williams Henderson, discovered it while sorting through her father's belongings in 1988. She read it cover to cover in a single sitting, learning details about her father's life that he had never shared. The entries were sparse, factual, almost clinical in their brevity, but between the lines she found a portrait of a man carrying an enormous burden with quiet dignity. On the page, dated March 17, 1945, beneath the brief note about shooting down the German ace, Williams had added a single line in smaller handwriting, as if written later that same evening. It read, "Mama would have been proud, Papa too. Wish they could have known." Patricia Williams Henderson donated the journal to the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture in 2016. It is now part of the permanent collection, displayed in a climate-controlled case alongside Williams's flight jacket, his distinguished flying cross, and a photograph of him standing beside his P-51 Mustang at Ramitelli Airfield. The museum's exhibition text places the journal in context, explaining the role of the Tuskegee Airmen, the discrimination they faced, and the excellence they achieved. The text mentions the engagement with Richter and notes the reports of Hitler's reaction, careful to describe these reports as unconfirmed but plausible. Museum visitors often pause at this display, reading Williams's sparse entries, trying to imagine what it must have been like to carry such weight, to fight so hard for a country that valued you so little. In 2018, a German historian named Dr. Sabine Müller published a comprehensive study of the final months of the Third Reich. Her research included extensive review of surviving documents, interviews with descendants of Nazi officials, and analysis of previously classified Soviet archives. In a chapter dealing with Hitler's psychological state during the collapse of Germany, Müller included a footnote about the engagement between Williams and Richter. She cited the Swedish intelligence report, Morrison's research from 1968, and several other sources that had touched on the incident over the years. Müller concluded that while definitive proof remained elusive, the preponderance of circumstantial evidence supported the conclusion that Hitler had been informed of the engagement and had reacted with characteristic fury. She noted that by March of 1945, Hitler's grip on reality was tenuous, his decision-making erratic, and his responses to bad news increasingly irrational. The news that a black pilot had defeated a German ace would have contradicted everything Hitler believed, and in his deteriorating mental state, such contradictions often triggered explosive reactions. But Müller also made another point, one that echoed what Jerome Williams himself had understood. She wrote that Hitler's reaction, whatever it may have been, was ultimately insignificant in the broader scope of history. The engagement mattered not because it may have angered a dying dictator, but because it demonstrated the falseness of the ideology that dictator represented. The achievement stood on its own merits, regardless of who noticed or how they responded. The men of the 332nd Fighter Group had proven their competence, their courage, and their professionalism in the most demanding test imaginable. They had done so while facing discrimination from their own military, while knowing that their victories would be minimized or ignored, while understanding that even if they survived the war, they would return to a segregated society that denied them basic rights. And they had done it anyway, because the job needed to be done, and they were the ones who had been given the chance to do it. Klaus Richter lived until 1994, dying at the age of 92 in Hamburg, Germany. In his final years, he gave several interviews to aviation historians and documentary filmmakers. He spoke openly about his career, his techniques, and his views on the war. When asked about being shot down by an American pilot from the 332nd Fighter Group, his response remained consistent with what he had told Dr. Eisenberg in the 1960s. He acknowledged that he had been beaten by a superior pilot in that engagement. He expressed respect for the skill demonstrated by his opponent. He confirmed that he had been told about the racial composition of the unit afterward, and that this information had been presented to him as significant by German intelligence officers. But he maintained that from his perspective as a pilot, the race of his opponent had been irrelevant. What mattered was capability, and his opponent had demonstrated superior capability. In one of his final interviews, conducted in 1992, Richter was asked directly about reports that Hitler had reacted angrily to news of his defeat. The interviewer pressed him, asking if he had ever received any communication from Hitler or from the Führer's headquarters regarding the incident. Richter paused, visibly uncomfortable. Then he said that he had been visited in the hospital by an officer from the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the German High Command. The officer had asked detailed questions about the engagement, about the American aircraft, about Richter's assessment of the pilot's skill level. At the end of the conversation, the officer had mentioned, almost casually, that the Führer was taking a personal interest in Luftwaffe performance and expected better results going forward. Richter said he had understood the implication. Someone very high up was unhappy about what had happened. But by that point in the war, Richter said, such concerns seemed absurd. Germany was collapsing. The end was obvious to anyone with eyes to see. Whether Hitler was angry about one aerial engagement was meaningless in the face of comprehensive defeat. This statement, one of the last Richter made before his death, comes as close as any historical source to confirming the core of the story. Hitler had been informed. Someone in his inner circle had made the racial aspect of the engagement explicit, and there had been consequences, or at least expressions of displeasure that filtered down through military channels. But the dramatic narrative of a lengthy tirade, of specific orders issued in rage, of ideological crisis triggered by a single combat, remains unverified. The reality appears to have been more mundane. Hitler was told something that contradicted his worldview. He expressed anger, as he often did when confronted with unwelcome information. Orders were issued for better performance, as they constantly were during the final months of the war. And then the war ground on toward its inevitable conclusion, and the incident was buried under the avalanche of defeat. The archival record preserves one final piece of evidence. In 2003, researchers at the German Federal Archives in Berlin discovered a previously uncatalogued box of documents from the Reichsluftfahrtministerium, the German Air Ministry. Among routine reports and administrative correspondence was a single-page memorandum dated March 21, 1945. The memorandum, marked strictly confidential, was addressed to all Luftwaffe commands. It ordered that detailed after-action reports be filed on all engagements with enemy fighters bearing red tail markings. It specified that these reports should include assessments of enemy pilot skill, tactical approaches used, and outcomes of engagements. The memorandum provided no explanation for this order, but the timing was unmistakable. It was issued 4 days after Williams shot down Richter. Someone in the German High Command wanted more information about the 332nd Fighter Group, and they wanted it systematically collected and reported. This memorandum was the last piece of contemporary documentation that directly connected to the engagement and its aftermath. No responses to the order have been found. If any Luftwaffe units filed the requested reports, those reports have been lost. The collapse of Germany came less than 6 weeks after the memorandum was issued, and in the chaos of defeat, record-keeping ceased to be a priority. But the memorandum itself stands as evidence that the engagement had attracted official attention at a high level, that it had been deemed significant enough to warrant special reporting procedures, and that the German military leadership was sufficiently concerned about the capabilities of Black American pilots to order systematic intelligence gathering. These facts, while not proving Hitler's personal reaction, demonstrate that the incident had impact within the Nazi hierarchy. The veterans of the 332nd Fighter Group held reunions annually for decades after the war. These gatherings, held in different cities across the United States, brought together men who had shared experiences that few others could understand. They told stories, remembered fallen comrades, and gradually, as years passed and the nation slowly confronted its history of racial discrimination, began to speak more openly about what their service had meant. At the reunion held in Atlanta, Georgia, in 2005, Lieutenant Marcus Johnson, then 87 years old, gave a speech that was recorded and later transcribed. He talked about the mission over Berlin, about flying wing for Jerome Williams, about the engagement with Richter and his grouper, and he said something that captured the essential truth of their experience. Johnson said that they had not flown those missions to prove anything to Hitler or to any other believer in racial supremacy. They had flown because they loved their country despite its flaws, because they believed in the cause of defeating fascism, and because they were determined to show that Black Americans could serve with distinction when given the opportunity. He said that every mission had been a statement, not spoken, but demonstrated through action. He said that shooting down German aces, protecting bombers, completing objectives, these were not symbolic victories, but real ones, measured in lives saved and objectives achieved. And he said that if Hitler had been upset by their success, that was simply evidence that their work was striking at the heart of what they were fighting against. The ideology of racial hierarchy could not survive contact with the reality of equal performance. Every time a black pilot flew a successful mission, that ideology died a little more. The engagement over Berlin had been one such death blow among thousands. The question remains, why does this story matter? Why does it continue to resonate decades after the events occurred, long after the principles have died, in a world that has changed dramatically from the one in which these men flew? The answer lies not in the uncertain details of Hitler's reaction, but in the undeniable fact of Williams's achievement and what it represented. In March of 1945, as Nazi Germany entered its final collapse, as the ideology of racial supremacy faced its ultimate repudiation, a black American pilot engaged and defeated one of Germany's most skilled aviators. He did so with professionalism, skill, and discipline. He did so as part of a unit that had overcome systematic discrimination to achieve an unmatched combat record. And he did so in a way that demonstrated beyond any possible argument that the theories of racial inferiority that had justified slavery, segregation, and genocide were simply false. This demonstration had consequences. It provided ammunition to those fighting for integration of the American military, a goal achieved in 1948 when President Harry Truman signed Executive Order 9981. It gave evidence to those arguing for civil rights, showing that black Americans could perform at the highest levels when given equal opportunity. It inspired future generations of black aviators, astronauts, and military leaders. And it stood as proof, in a world still grappling with the legacy of racism, that excellence recognizes no racial boundaries. These consequences mattered far more than whether Hitler had a tantrum in a bunker beneath Berlin. The men themselves understood this. In interview after interview, in memoir after memoir, the Tuskegee Airmen expressed pride not in having angered their enemies, but in having served their country with distinction. They took satisfaction not from Hitler's alleged reaction, but from their combat record, from the bombers they protected, from the missions they completed. They knew that their real victory was not symbolic, but concrete. They had kicked down a door that had been closed to black Americans. They had created opportunities for those who came after. They had changed their nation's military forever. Whether Hitler noticed or cared was irrelevant to that achievement. Jerome Marcus Williams died on July 14, 1987, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. His funeral was attended by family, friends, and a small delegation from the Tuskegee Airman organization. The ceremony was simple and dignified, reflecting the man's character. No mention was made of Hitler or of reactions in Berlin 42 years earlier. Instead, speakers talked about Williams's life after the war, his work as an accountant, his dedication to his family, his quiet involvement in his community. One speaker, a fellow veteran from the 332nd, mentioned that Williams had once said the measure of a man was not what he did in extraordinary circumstances, but how he handled ordinary life. Williams had handled ordinary life with the same competence and dignity he had brought to combat. He had been, the speaker said, a good pilot, a good soldier, and a good man. That was the eulogy Williams would have wanted. His service record, filed at the National Personnel Record Center in St. Louis, Missouri, documents the facts of his military career. Enlisted December 1942, completed flight training September 1943, assigned to 332nd Fighter Group November 1943, deployed to Italy January 1944. Flew 137 combat missions, 42 confirmed aerial victories, distinguished Flying Cross with 3 oak leaf clusters, Air Medal with 16 oak leaf clusters, promoted to Major April 1945, honorably discharged October 1945. The record is comprehensive and precise. It documents achievement without emotion, accomplishment without commentary. It is exactly the kind of record Williams would have appreciated, focusing on what was done rather than what it might have meant. But history is more than records and documents. History is the meaning we derive from events, the patterns we recognize, the lessons we learn. The engagement between Captain Jerome Williams and Oberstleutnant Klaus Richter on March 17, 1945, is documented in mission reports, after-action summaries, and intelligence files. The achievements of the 332nd Fighter Group are preserved in official histories and military archives. The discrimination these men faced is recorded in training documents, policy memos, and the lived experience of those who survived. All of this is factual and verifiable. What remains uncertain is the response of those who witnessed these achievements, particularly those invested in denying that such achievements were possible. Adolf Hitler killed himself in his bunker beneath Berlin on April 30, 1945, 6 weeks after Williams shot down Richter. Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 8, 1945. The Nazi regime, its ideology of racial supremacy, and its ambitions for continental domination ended in comprehensive defeat. Among the countless factors that contributed to this defeat was one that Hitler's ideology could never acknowledge: the contributions of those he had declared inferior. Black American soldiers, including the pilots of the 332nd Fighter Group, helped destroy the regime that claimed they were incapable of such contributions. Whether Hitler understood this irony, whether it troubled him in his final days, whether news of Williams' victory was among the many factors that demonstrated the falseness of everything he believed, cannot be known with certainty. But the irony exists regardless of whether Hitler perceived it. The final word belongs to the men themselves, or rather, to the silence they mostly chose. Jerome Williams never wrote a memoir. He never gave public speeches. He never sought recognition or fame. He lived quietly, worked steadily, raised his family, and died leaving behind only a slim journal and the memories of those who knew him. This choice of silence was itself a statement. It said that the achievement spoke for itself, that those who needed convincing would not be convinced by speeches or publicity, and that the work of changing society happened not in dramatic moments, but in the steady accumulation of proof that old assumptions were wrong. Williams provided that proof every day of his military service. What others chose to do with that proof was their responsibility, not his. In the decades since these events occurred, the story of the Tuskegee Airmen has become part of American historical consciousness. Books have been written, films have been made, museums have created exhibitions. The 332nd Fighter Group has received recognition that was denied during their service. Congressional gold medals have been awarded, streets have been renamed, monuments have been erected. This recognition is important and long overdue. But it also risks reducing complex human beings to symbols, individual stories to collective narrative, nuanced truth to simplified myth. The engagement between Williams and Richter gets retold as a moment when a black pilot struck a blow against Nazi ideology, when Hitler's racist worldview was challenged by undeniable evidence of black excellence. This retelling is not false, but it is incomplete. The complete story includes Williams's skill as a pilot, developed through countless hours of practice and refined through desperate combat. It includes the institutional racism that nearly prevented him from flying at all, the discrimination he faced even after proving his capabilities, and the injustice of returning from war to a segregated nation. It includes Richter's own complicated position, a skilled pilot serving an evil regime, fighting bravely for a cause that was morally indefensible. It includes the fog of war, the chaos of combat, the split-second decisions that determined life or death. It includes the limits of what we can know, the documents that were destroyed or never created, the stories that were never told. And it includes the choice that Williams and many of his fellow veterans made, to live quietly after the war, to let their achievements speak without demanding recognition, to focus on building lives rather than defending legacies. This complete story is harder to tell than the simplified version. It requires acknowledging uncertainty, accepting that some questions cannot be answered definitively, resisting the temptation to make everything neat and symbolic. But it is closer to the truth, closer to what actually happened in the sky over Berlin on March 17, 1945, and in the years that followed. Captain Jerome Marcus Williams, flying his P-51 Mustang, engaged and defeated Oberstleutnant Klaus Richter in aerial combat. This fact is documented and undeniable. Whether this fact troubled Adolf Hitler, whether it contributed in any measurable way to the collapse of Nazi ideology, whether it represented a symbolic victory beyond its tactical importance, these questions admit of no certain answer. But the fact itself stands, requiring no embellishment, needing no interpretation, sufficient in its own right as testament to courage, skill, and the falseness of the racist assumptions that denied these men their chance to serve. The voices that still echo from that era, the voices of men like Williams and Johnson and Davis, and the hundreds of others who flew and fought and survived, tell a consistent story. They speak of determination in the face of discrimination, of excellence despite obstacles, of service to a country that did not fully value their service. They speak of brotherhood forged in combat, of losses that still hurt decades later, of pride in work well done. They speak of ordinary men, doing extraordinary things, not because they were saints or superheroes, but because the job needed doing, and they were the ones there to do it. And they speak, in their own way, to a simple truth that transcends the specific events of any single engagement. Human capability cannot be limited by the arbitrary boundaries of race or ethnicity. Those who deny this truth, whether Adolf Hitler or anyone else before or since, are not refuted by arguments or speeches, but by the accumulated evidence of achievement. The 332nd Fighter Group provided that evidence in abundance. Did you enjoy this story? Your support helps us continue producing new documentaries. A like, a comment, or a share makes all the difference. See more historical cases on our channel, and if you're not subscribed yet, join our community. I'll see you in the next episode.